So I just thought I really appreciate Clayton being willing to spend some time with us. And he's Chief Executive Officer of Spatial Audio. I'm not sure how long he's been there as opposed to some former companies, but I'm sure he'll give us a little bit of his history. I think a lot of people know I have a pair of his speakers here, and I'm enjoying them quite a bit. So I'll let Clayton go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted first to thank the Society for inviting me. I think this is a great format, like Leslie said, and you don't even have to leave your house, right? So it's a great way to get together, at least for now. So anyway, I appreciate being here. I'll just keep it real low key, and I do have on the sidebar here on I've got a very small screen, but there's a list of questions from Larry here. I'll just go right down the list. First of all, how much time do we have? Because I can tend to talk too long. But
we're scheduled to go till 3 o'clock California time, so 4.
Oh wow!
But,
good.
So we have almost 2 hours.
Okay. Well, the first one is describe the evolution of the company. Let me back up a little prior to that. Is that this is actually, well, I guess the third company that I've had. So my first company was Emerald Physics, which a lot of people may or may not have heard of. I think Leslie knows who it is, but that started in 1978, and that was mainly, that was not to manufacture products. That was R&D, and we designed products for all kinds of companies, industrial companies and things like that. So, and we did actually, I'll get into that later, but we did eventually produce products for the audiophile market under the Emerald Physics brand starting in about 2007. And then I sold that company in 2010. Spatial was already going. The focus of Spatial initially was computer audio, because it was pretty clear that it was going to go that way. So we thought it would be wise to go ahead and take the power of a computer like the Mac Mini and do more things with it, do room correction, electronic crossover, fully active system in the computer, and then go out USB or FireWire at the time to a good DAC. And that was a pretty effective way to go. That's what Spatial was doing initially. We did that for 3 or 4 years. I had a non-compete clause that it was a 3-year term when I sold Emerald Physics, so I couldn't technically really market any product speakers under the Spatial name until 2014. So of course, as you can imagine, during the period from 2010 through 2013, I was busy working on speaker design, and so that when the non-compete clause was up, I would be ready to pull the trigger and do something. So the designs that I came out with initially, like the M1 under the Spatial brand, were pretty similar to Emerald Physics, but the new ones did not require any electronic processing. They could just be plugged into an amplifier, passive crossover, so forth. So that's where I wanted to go. But using this technique of high efficiency and open baffle, I didn't know how. I couldn't do that prior in the 2000s or prior to 2010. I had to have a processor in order to be able to pull that off. But I started from scratch in 2010 and designed all my own stuff so that I could control the variables, and then with some fairly interesting crossover technology, I was able to make a passive plug-and-play speaker that sounded at least as good, if not better, than what we had before. So that's kind of how it started. And the evolution, I'll just get to the point on that. The ideas behind it have not changed at all. We have improved. We have probably 3 generations at least: the M1, M2, and then the M3 and M4. Like I see Mark White is on here. He has M4s. Okay, so that was a.
Absolutely.
Huh?
Absolutely. Nice to be here.
I see. Yeah, thanks for coming.
Sure.
So that period from about 2015 to 2019, we made kind of the product range that most people are familiar with, like the M3 and M4. Those products became just skyrocketed in popularity, and that really is kind of when we got our sea legs as far as, you know, people having heard of the brand and becoming somewhat of a player in the market. And but our idea is new and different. It's similar to Pure Audio Project's products, but other open baffle speakers haven't really been mainstream enough to really, that people really know much about them in the marketplace, like the Linkwitz design, for example. Unless you were really into audio, you might not have ever really known about them. But so my designs were new to most people. Let's just say it that way, to the marketplace.
Clayton, I don't know if everybody has seen your speakers, and I think they're particularly attractive.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could show them, I remember we met when 5-6 years ago. It was long time ago, and it was your first group, and it was like your room at one of the audio shows was really one of my favorites because your speakers were absolutely beautiful and they sounded amazing. They really did. So I think it'd be great if people haven't seen them to actually be able to see them.
Why don't I pull up a picture? Is there, how do you do that?
You do.
So Clayton, at the bottom of the control panel, there's a share screen, and you can click a button for that and share a particular image that you bring up on your desktop if you like.
Yeah, so just show us the.
Do I hit share screen first and then go open a file?
It's probably best just to pull the file up first. It will work either way. You can share your desktop if you want, or just a particular picture, but you've got some beautiful photos on your portfolio on your website. So just even going to your website, even going to your website, you could share those.
Why don't I do that? That might be easier, quicker rather.
Could you post the link to your website in the chat, please?
Yeah, sure.
Larry, you could just stand up and move out of the way of your speakers so everybody could see them.
Yeah, Larry's got some right there.
Right here.
So can you guys see? Oh, there we go.
Oh, you were there, but then gone.
Yeah. Share screen. Okay, so you can, that's pretty cool. You can click on whatever you want to share.
Mm-hmm. Yep, there we go.
There you go.
And that's the M5 like Larry has. And then the M3 is the same design, but it has twin 15-inch drivers. And it comes in a number of different finishes and paints and so forth, you know. Can you see that, you guys?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, and then that's what's been at the shows recently. We had a lot of fanfare, you know, at the Capitol Audio Fest and the Florida Flat Show. We showed that with the linear tube audio 12-watt David Burning design Z10, and that was a pretty cool system. So let me go back. Oh, now what up? I don't know how to unshare it now because the.
So there's a tab, Clayton, on the upper right where it says you're viewing Clayton Shaw's screen under view options. You can stop sharing. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So the models you just saw are a pretty big evolutionary step over this previous lineup. And in, you know, hold on just a second. Go back to the, I'm sorry. So part of that, what the the two basic things that happened since the models that we were talking about that were from 2015 to 2019, called the M3 and M4, was that we worked with Peerless, which is a Danish company that makes tweeters, really high quality tweeters. It's kind of like, it's actually the same company as ScanSpeak now. And they had developed a new ceramic diaphragm system, a synthetic sapphire diaphragm. And when I saw the specifications and the measurements of it, I just almost couldn't believe it. I mean, it was basically a straight line, and the thing goes down to 600 hertz and up to 40 kilohertz. So there's really, I think, a breakthrough in tweeter technology. But they didn't want to hear what I was asking for, Fearless, which was, yeah, that's great, love it, but I want to use it down to 600 hertz, not multiples. Normally, you want to cross it over at least twice, whatever the Fourier resonance is. So, because, and I'll get to that in a second, that's one of the 5 design principles that we use, is a low crossover point. That solves a whole bunch of problems. So they were working with them, they were able to add a lot of features that I asked for that would increase power handling and heat dissipation quick enough to where we could run it that low at 600 and not burn it up. So that's called the M100 is the name of that driver. It looks like a tweeter. It looks like it's a 1 1/4 inch diaphragm. But it operates down way into the mid-range, so it's covering a huge part of the spectrum by itself. So it is a two-way format, like we had before. So there's like in Larry's case, there's one 15-inch woofer. That's a completely new design too, and that has a lot more bass. It goes quite a bit deeper, and it's tighter than the woofer design that we used previously. So marrying those two up and having a really smooth integrated crossover at about 575 hertz is what an M5 is. The M Sapphire. The M3 Sapphire is the same speaker, but it has what's essentially, it's the same woofer below it, a second driver, but it's crossed over at 90 hertz. So you could kind of say it's a subwoofer, integrated subwoofer, but it's still all passive. So if you want more bass, larger rooms, that kind of thing, that's really what the M3 is used for. And it sells for $5,000 a pair. The smaller single woofer M5 version is $3,500 a pair. So the evolution of the company has been basically a lot of R&D developments that we kind of meld into the new product. So when a new product comes out, there's usually a whole slew of things that we've been saving up that we've developed. And that's the case certainly here. The series above it, called the X series, the X5 and X3 are a little different. I'll talk about them a little later, but they also have a lot of new ideas in it that we just simply didn't know about a few years ago. So that's question number 1. Leslie, do we want to allow people to ask questions about that or go to the next topic?
I think we have the chat box. If anybody sends something in, you can keep the chat box over kind of to the side of your screen. You can watch it.
Yeah, got it. I didn't even see that. I wish the screen wasn't so tiny. I'm trying to put everything on once.
Well, sometimes, Larry, do you want to monitor the chat box? Larry can monitor, and if something comes up, just pop in.
Well, there was one.
I'll look at it.
Yeah, so you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, that's fine. There was one, I think, that Larry sent in that was, does Clayton have a home system? And the answer is not right at the moment because I've just moved, but I do most of my listening at work anyway. And so that's really, I do that all day. So I kind of don't really need a home system per se, but yeah. And then there's another question, what's the efficiency of each model? The new Sapphire series models are right around 92, which is lower than what we've done in the past, but it has to do with the fact that this dome driver, that's the efficiency level that it operates at, so we can't go any higher. The X models above that are much higher, they're 97, and they're at 8 ohms. So they are in there. in an X5 and an X3, the subwoofer driver is self-powered, so your amp is only driving the mid-range 12-inch driver and the air motion transformer. So basically 100 hertz and up. That makes it a perfect speaker for using little 2A3s, 45 tubes, 300Bs. That a lot of guys buy them for that reason. And how did you get into audio gear? I'm sure everybody has a kind of maybe a similar story. My background was only different maybe in the sense that my family were all musicians. I was the only one in the family who wasn't. I was more of the, you know, the techie kind of guy, the engineer kind of guy. So I never picked up playing a musical instrument. But later on, I realized looking back, I think what really has worked for me or kind of locked this whole speaker design thing in for me as an influence is really the fact that my sister was playing. We had a Steinway baby grand in our house, and 6 a.m. every morning practice, bam, 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 every morning, at least 6 days a week. I was listening to this from another room, you know, the piano playing, which drove me crazy. But that over a period of time, that really is a big advantage because I know what a piano sounds like, and that's all you actually need to know about speaker to develop a good speaker is to know what a piano sounds like, because it covers 10 octaves of range and it has a lot of harmonics and, you know, decay, resonant decay information. So if you kind of know what that sounds like, that's a huge help, I think. But so anyway, I was also, since I wasn't interested in playing a instrument, but I was loved to build things and was mechanical and everything. By 12 or 13 years old, I was already big into building speakers because, and I've mentioned this in some of the other, you know, interviews and so forth. So I don't want to keep saying the same thing, but basically back, you know, I'm 63. So in the early 70s, in most cities, there was an Allied Radio Shack. And that was an awesome place to go because they had crossovers and drivers and tube amplifier kits and all this stuff. And it was literally like a mile from my house. So teenagers as well as adults could just buy stuff and experiment and learn and everything. So that's what I did in my teenage years. And then there was a regional kind of speaker company in the town I grew up in called Norman Laboratories. And it was a fairly popular loudspeaker brand kind of in that part. I grew up in Norman, Oklahoma. So in that sort of Texas, Oklahoma, you know, part of the country, this Norman Labs was really popular. So I basically walked in there and said, I want to work here, you know, and I'm just a kid, of course, but they were looking at me like, you know, what the hell are you going to do? And I just said, I don't want to be paid. I just want to work here. So that was good because I got early experience in manufacturing of speakers and crossover design and all that stuff. Because back at that time, you know, nowadays you can download simulation modeling software that's fairly easy to operate and learn how to do a lot of this stuff by plugging stuff into simulators. But back then you couldn't. You had to do everything. It was just straight math on paper, pretty much. And so then in college, I studied physics and electronics, and there was a really amazing hi-fi store on campus corner called the Gramophone, the Gramophone Limited. And so I walk in there and this is 1975, I guess. I walk in there, they have Audio Research, Mark Levinson, Dayton Wright, Dahlquist, Magna Planer. They had everything, Lynn, and I'm like, okay, you know, because up to then it was all I knew about was Pioneer and stuff like that, right? And so I went to work there. I quit that one job, went to work at this place, and just absolutely loved that. And so I was around high-end audio, serious stuff early on when I was 18 or whatever. And I knew that this was what I was going to always be involved in. But the real long-term goal was I want to be a designer. I want to develop a better speaker than anybody else. And I think that's the way most speaker designers tell you essentially the same story. there's some kind of a drive that, you know, my buddy at Tecton will tell you the same thing. Most guys will, there's some kind of just internal drive that says, I have to develop a better and better and better speaker system. So that's in your blood, and that's been that way for over 40 years now, you know. So let's see. Oh, can you talk about the X2 and the Lumina speakers? Yeah, let's get through some of these kind of basic ones first. Oh, what were your early challenges? That's I haven't had that question before in starting a company. Well, I think it's the same with any little company. You know, if you guys have ever tried to start a small company, limited capital is always the #1 problem, because if you want to be a manufacturer, you need a lot of capital to make a product at a reasonable price, because you're going to have to buy large quantities, particularly if they're, you know, if you're making custom driver designs, you're going to have to go to Eminence or somebody and order 500 of these. So where's that money going to come from? And you have to have a facility. So, you know, it's a pretty, I mean, I think right now we're at about $20,000 a month, just raw cost to operate. And compared to when I was just, you know, in my house 35 years ago, that's a big deal. You have to build some momentum, because you can start out and make, like Don Sachs or all kinds of people we could come up with, Vinny Rossi, you know, where you do it in your house. Electronics are great that way because you don't need a facility, and keep your overhead really low. And that solves a lot of the problems. But even then, I think, so that's #1 is capital. #2 is how do you get traction in the market? And when a lot of us originally were in high-end audio, we were reading all the way back to maybe, you know, early Stereophile, but certainly Absolute Sound and all these things. A lot of those companies were just basically garage operations, including Paul McGowan, who'll be on next. I mean, he would tell you that. So the, I forgot now my train of thought there, but yeah, the traction idea is that back in those days, the magazines are all you had. If Absolute Sound didn't do a review on you, or Stereophile or Audio or one of these, or they didn't like the product, you were basically screwed. You were going to be like, you'd have to do what Richard Vanderstein did, which is get in your car, put some speakers, some you know, Vanderstein 2As or whatever they were, and drive them around the country. That's literally what and then try to afford to go to the CES in Chicago, which was pretty expensive. And then even then, you're talking about years and years and years of just dragging it out, trying to get people to, you know, kind of adopt your brand and be a household name. So it took 5 to 10 years for most companies to do that, unless it was just a hit, like out of the box, like the Dahlquist DQ10. When it came out, it was boom. You know, the dealers all picked it up. That Vanderstein 2C to some degree was that way. MG1 Magnapan, some of those kind of products. But now it's much easier. The only good thing about back then was there was a lot less competition. If you're going to go out and look at a tube power amp, you've got Conrad Johnson, ARC, and a couple of other Audible Illusions, a couple of things that were less known. And now there's how many? 200. If you include European brands, there's hundreds of tube amplifier companies now. So that's the challenge now, is how do you rise above the noise of just the general market that's just full of stuff. But at least now with the internet and all these regional shows like Rocky Mountain and Expona, you can get the word out, and forums, obviously, like Audio Circle, you can get kind of a contagious effect where when people start talking about your product, it doesn't take long for everyone to find out about it. So I actually think it's easier now, but it is very expensive to see. Our product is all made in the US with a few parts that are made in Germany and Denmark. really expensive to make a quality American-made product, which is exactly why larger companies like B&W and KEF all have their stuff made in China, because they're having to give half the price margin to the dealers. So how in the world would they make money if they built it here? But I'm not ever going to build a product in China. So I just have to come up with a more sort of clever approach where I can make a product that's better and it's affordable and it's US made. And I think you're looking at it with this new product line. That's exactly what we have. It's not super inexpensive or anything, but it's the real thing. It's an authentic American invention type of product. Okay, let me see. Have your products evolved over time? Yeah, we've talked about that. What is your design philosophy? Okay, well, I'll just mention the 5 rules or the 5 principles that I go by in no particular order necessarily, but the most important one, as you would probably expect, I would say, is open baffle, because in the bass and mid-range, because if it's not open baffle, if it's a box design, you're just in for a whole set of issues that you can't get around. A sealed box has less of the problems than a vented box, but no matter how you slice it, a box radiates bass energy omnidirectionally, so it's very interactive with the room energy, and you get a lot of problems with cancellation in the bass, so you get a real wavy up and down frequency response in the bass. And if there were another way to get, so what you need is a directional bass approach. So if you could just shoot bass directionally from the speaker at you and eliminate all the room interaction, you're like way ahead of the game right there already. So that's what, and I've been exposed to this since around 1990 or so, but I didn't introduce a product to the consumer market until that one I mentioned in 2007. But, and I've designed, since the 70s, I've been designing box speakers, so I know what the limitations are of them, and it explains my frustration with them, because if you go hear like a live piano or live orchestra or chamber orchestra, and then you listen to your box speakers, it just doesn't work for me. I just don't think it's close enough to the kind of presentation that's organic and three-dimensional and relaxed. That an open baffle isn't perfect, but it gets you 90% of the way there. And so that solves kind of the major problem in speaker design, is the bass interacting with the room in home audio, where rooms are not very big. In auditoriums, it doesn't really apply, but in houses, rooms are too small for box speakers in homes. So, and I'm sticking to that. I mean, I've proven that over and over and over, and I think other people that have heard open baffle usually almost always agree with that. It's like, yeah, that just works better. Now, you could design a poor sounding open baffle speaker, but if you do it correctly, the principle gives you a massive advantage in the bass and the mid-range. Not so much in the treble, where you get the ping pong room reflection effects and things. Anyway, so that's number one, and that's a requirement in my designs, is it has to be open baffle bass and mid-range. Number two is, again, no particular order, but it has to have linear response. And I don't mean, two things I don't mean is, I don't mean on axis, and I don't mean flat response. Linear simply means that it's not waving around and there's peaks and dips. And its overall tonal level is equal to the mid-range. Because if you say flat, you can't really, it depends on how far the microphone is, for example, when you take a measurement from the speaker. The further you get back, the more treble will look like it's drooping down. So, but it might still be linear. So linearity is really, really important. Your ears are quite sophisticated and can pick up on little dips and peaks and broad dips and broad peaks and all of that. And that always is distracting from reality, and it'll distract you in the sense that you notice the speaker. And so we have these 5 principles, but the goal is actually a disappearing act. I don't want to hear speakers. And by definition, if you don't hear the speaker, that already means that it has to have all these things going on. It has to be linear. If there's a peak at 1 kilohertz, you're going to hear it. You're going to notice the speaker. The distortion level has to be low. Otherwise, you'll notice it. So everything, the disappearing act is kind of the ultimate thing. So we don't really talk about our speakers being really good. We talk about trying to achieve a disappearing act sort of effect. But linearity, getting back to that, it has to be not just in front of the speaker, but as you move the microphone off at 10, 20, 30 degrees, it needs to be linear out there too. And here's why. The first reflection of energy that's coming off the wall boundary on the side wall is going to bounce off the wall and blend in with that direct sound that's coming directly from the speaker. And your brain tries to sum those. It tries to reconcile the direct and the reflected information. So if the signal that's bouncing off the wall, which means the kind of off-axis energy that's coming off at a 30-degree angle off the speaker, if you measure that response and it's not flat and it's not related very well to the on-axis response, then your ear is going to have a tough time trying to assimilate 2 different signals, basically. And that is what listening fatigue mostly is about, is the fact that it's confusing. It's like, what is going on here? Because it's like there's 2 or 3 different pairs of speakers that have different frequency response, all playing at the same time. So if you do it correctly to where where you measure it off axis and you compare that, and it's almost the same exact thing as on axis, although it'll be a little lower, it'll kind of droop down, but if it has the same shape, then it's very accurate sounding. You get excellent imaging, you get low listening fatigue, and that's proper speaker engineering. If you go through the archive files on the Stereophile site, they have loudspeaker, all of the measurement suites that Atkinson did on floor standards and on bookshelves. Just rifle through all these and see how bad they are. It's quite astonishing how poor off-axis most speakers are. And that is one of the reasons that guys get on a treadmill. They try a speaker, they don't really like it that much, particularly over time. They sell it and they go buy something else based on some other review. They keep it for a while, and that's largely to do with the fact the speaker is interacting with the room too much. You're not actually hearing the speaker unless you get really close to it. So sitting closer up to the point, to where it still sounds like the drivers are integrating, that's a great way to solve a lot of problems, because near-field listening eliminates most of that room sound and that room interaction sound. And that's why studios more and more are focusing on near-field monitors because of that. It gets rid of the room sound. But in any event, so linearity is big. I'm not quite sure why so many of speakers have such poor response. It's even some of the ones that are quite expensive. You're thinking, what excuse really is for that? I don't know the answer to that, but I won't tolerate it. I mean, our stuff just is super linear. And the review that New Record Day is getting ready to publish, I don't know, maybe within the next 30 days or so, he took his own measurements, and I haven't seen his yet, but you'll see how amazingly flat they are. And well, not flat, but linear, like I said, and good polar response. So number 3 is what's called controlled directivity. It's actually kind of the same thing. It means that the speaker has good polar response, but it also tends to mean that it's usually used in the discussion where the dispersion angle isn't quite as wide, so that there'll be less trouble hitting the boundaries. If you look at our X models, they have the air motion transformer unit has an 80-degree waveguide on it, so that we control how wide the dispersion pattern can be. So when you narrow it down and it's linear in the off axis, the polar response, you get a very, very uniform effect in all different kinds of rooms. Even rooms that are crappy as far as not where there's no acoustic treatment, they can still, it solves a lot of the treble room problems. So that's what control directivity really means. It means constant radiation angle with frequency. So at 500 hertz, 5 kilohertz, 15 kilohertz, that it's all, we want to be around 80 degrees across a wide spectrum. And generally, speakers don't do that very well. Again, as you can see in like Atkinson's measurements, but that's very important again in terms of trying to get a good response in an actual room where you're say 10 feet away from it, where you're getting a lot of the room and a lot of direct sound mixed together. So the waveguide approach will, and this is why studios use it all the time, it changes the ratio to where the room level is dropped down some, maybe 5 or 10 dB, so that you hear more of the direct field and less of the reflected field. So that's been around for quite some time, but that's rarely do you see that in consumer speakers. Low crossover points, number 4. The more you think about this, the more you start realizing that low crossover point is a massive advantage. Now you could argue that a wideband full range driver like a Lowther or that type of driver would be great because there's no crossover network at all, and it covers a wide spectrum, and the mid-range is not being chopped up. And that would be great if there wasn't this thing called physics where the cone is too heavy to produce treble, and it has very poor directivity effects. It's when you measure this polar response, it's much worse than normal. So if you do a wideband driver and you put it in a room, then the confusion of the reflected in the direct field is worse than a regular speaker with a tweeter. So since that doesn't really work from a physics standpoint, I just take the opposite approach, is that if I can drive the crossover point down to around 500 hertz, then I don't hear any effects of crossovers. And a lot of the reasons speakers have problems with polar response, whereas as the microphone moves around around 10, 20, 30 degree angle, you start seeing this big dip open up, like right in the mid-range and upper mid-range. And it's wherever the crossover point is. So if the crossover is 2 kilohertz, you see this big dip opening up. Well, okay, all the sound that's bouncing off the wall over here and the floor, that has that dip built in it now. So that's not going to blend with the direct field. But okay, what happens if we take that crossover point instead of 2,500 or 1,500 or whatever, drive it down to 600 or 500? Then the wavelengths are long enough to where you don't see any polar dropouts at all. So number 1, the polar response is a lot better. Number 2, it's a lot faster and more revealing because now at 500 or 600 hertz, we have a ceramic diaphragm that's a pure piston that weighs 1/3 of a gram, reproducing mid-range, instead of a cone that has all kinds of resonant behavior in the cone. If you look at the surface of the cone, there's areas that are in and out of phase with each other right on the surface. And it doesn't have any directivity control. It may weigh anywhere from 20 to 80 grams. It's too heavy. So resolution is the second reason. The third reason is that most guys that I think rightly have said, hey, the reason I like a widebander design is that it just sounds more, there's better continuity. It doesn't feel like it's been torn apart and put back together like in a multi-way speaker. And I agree with that. I hear that. But again, the problem is that the widebander can't do treble. So it really doesn't. This is why Zoo Audio has a tweeter from 10K and above, because the physics really don't allow that widebander to do treble correctly. So it's a compromise. So But if we could take the crossover down low enough, basically all the problems go away. Now we're not switching where your ear's really sensitive, kind of in that 1K to 4K, say, range. If you're switching off to a driver from a cone to a dome, you can hear that no matter how good, even if the crossover is really well integrated. Most guys will say, yeah, it doesn't really sound seamless. And a good test of that is to take raw drivers, take a raw dome, drop tweeter, and a raw woofer with nothing hooked up to it, and just play full range sound through each one and see how different they just sound on a basic level. They're just not related in how they sound at all. So what I'm doing is I'm having most of the spectrum that is critical from 600 to 40K, or 20K is all we care about really, is coming out of one single driver, and it's extremely small. So you're kind of getting the benefits that you could say you could get maybe from an electrostatic speaker, but you don't have the issues of big planers where you have issues with scaling of instrument size and all that. It's point source. But you have that kind of speed. So it has electrostatic kind of speed, but it has excellent polar response, and it has, for that type of device anyway. And it's all coming out of one driver, see? So that's what the M series is about, like Larry has, like the M5. Okay, the last one, and then I'll shut up for a minute. The number 5 is high efficiency. And I think that if you go back 10 or 15, 20 years, high efficiency was so sort of out of vogue that we didn't talk much about it at all. Because what would you go buy that was high efficiency in 2005? I'm sure we could think of a few things, because Klipsch was making some of these redoing these retro models and so forth, legacy models. But in the recent years, it's become a lot more of a common topic, because a lot of guys have realized that there's a direct relationship between the efficiency of the speaker and the perceived dynamic range and realism of the sound you get out of the speaker. And all other things equal. So in other words, you could have the challenge with high efficiency is how do you get the other things? It's difficult to get linearity and good polar response out of a speaker that's 100 dB sensitivity, because you're having to use horns, things get complicated real fast. So a lot of the high efficiency designs tend to have some problems that are kind of like, yeah, but, kind of a trade-off thing. But if you take the Klipsch Cornwall, for example, which a lot of guys are now starting to buy, and they're making it again, the dynamic range is so obvious and so obviously more like real music that you notice it as soon as you turn it on. And then when you go back to your conventional speaker, you're like, whether you like the conventional speaker or not, you got to admit that there's a big gap in realism going on. So my theory has been that 95 is a good place to be, sensitivity, because if you go up into the 100 dB sensitivity range, a lot of times you run into noise problems in the system to where you can hear background noise and things that start becoming an issue when you get into the super high efficiency range. But 95 is high enough, in the 92 even that we have on the M series. When you get that efficient, you get this sort of dynamic realism that's quite convincing that you don't get at 87 or 88 or whatever. So we've been doing that all along. All of the speakers that I've ever produced since 2007 are all 92 is the lowest, 92 to 100. So we've had this multi-pronged attack. If you can combine a speaker that doesn't have much room interaction with the speed and articulation of open baffle bass and its high efficiency, and it's a good design overall, it's linear, it's smooth, it's low distortion, then a conventional design, I don't think you can compete with it. I haven't heard one yet that can. But my opinion doesn't really matter, but that's how I feel about it, which is what's driving these design parameters, is my own exposure to these various different types of approaches. So okay, there are some more chat things here. Have you considered cardioid bass? Cardioid cardioid base works. When I was in the pro audio design business, we used that. You can have a woofer mounted on the rear that has a separate enclosure, enclosed space, and reduce the volume level of that driver, and it solves a bunch of problems in pro audio where you have feedback going on with microphones on stage, and that's primarily why cardioid bass is used. But that's way too complicated to, and you still have a box. He still sounds like a box. It would have less room interaction, but it would still sound boxy. No need to do that with an open baffle woofer. You mount it to the panel, you're done if you design it right. So there's not really a need in home audio for cardioid bass, I don't think. What is the main barrier between reproduced sound and live music? Number one, the microphones. Nobody really knows how poor microphones are, I think, in a sense. So we're kind of off already in a compromised situation right from the very beginning of the chain. But the second thing the second thing is stereo has its own limitations. Mixing and the stereo two-channel approach has its own limitations and drawbacks. Everything along the chain is potentially some kind of drawback. So it's a cumulative kind of, the problems kind of build up, I think. But and then the last thing I can think of right off the top of my head is back to high efficiency again. Live music has a dynamic envelope that just blows your mind, and you go home and just go, I'm just not getting that out of my stereo. So that would be what I'd say about that. Are your speakers designed to be less affected by floor bounce? Yes and no. The X series is, because it has the waveguide treble. It's a 30-degree vertical dispersion, so that's exactly why it's 30 degrees to limit floor bounce. Floor bounce is mostly a non-issue in open baffle on the bass end, so we don't really have too much concern about that. Do low crossover points cause issues because of the displacement required to appropriate SPL? That is an excellent question. So what they're saying there is, okay, it's great that you can lower the crossover, but how does it play loud enough? Because what they're saying, the term displacement means every time you have the frequency, like every time you go an octave lower, you need twice to 4 times the displacement by the diaphragm to reproduce it. So what we have to do is we have to develop a device, in this case, that M100 tweeter, that has a special suspension modification to where it can move at the required distance. We could just say it's the world's first long throw tweeter maybe, but it has the displacement necessary for 600 hertz and can do it without overheating. That's just a design thing. Now, cone drivers already do that, and compression drivers do that pretty well. All our earlier designs we all used compression drivers, and that's a special type of design that has chambers on both sides of the diaphragm, and it's horn loaded. And those can play quite low. Our crossover points used to be around 800 hertz, and we were running them first order, and you could play it at any way louder than an audiophile speaker. So it depends on the device. And in the X series, we're using a special studio air motion transformer that's horn loaded. And so you get the benefits of the super low distortion of the air motion transformer, but you get directivity control from the waveguide. And it goes low. It goes down to 1,000 hertz. So it's all about the design. Otherwise, it would probably blow up if you didn't do it right.
So Clayton, we have a few from the other email I sent you. Maybe we can go through a few of those, but one question is about tube amps, and I think you talked about that a little bit, but can you talk about impedance, minimum impedance in your speakers and how that works with tubes?
Sure.
And wattage?
Yeah, so impedance and efficiency and all the stuff as it relates to tube amps is almost, almost completely a low frequency issue, not all the way, but What happens if you take a woofer and you do an impedance plot on it and its free of resonance is 40 hertz, you'll see a big single peak at 40. Then on the other side of that, above that in frequency, you see kind of the low point of its impedance. So if it's an 8 ohm woofer and that low point is 6, you'd say, well, you know, at what's called the minima would be 6 ohms. But the problem is when you stick that into a box, it usually drives that down quite a bit lower, or can, depending on the alignment of the box woofer design. But so let's say in the range from 50 to 80 hertz, that same, instead of 6 ohms, it might be 5 or 4 or something in a box. But again, that's not a rule, just because it depends on the box design and all of that. But whatever it is, you have to look at two things. You have to look at how low it goes, and you have to look at how fast the phase angle changes. Because if the phase angle doesn't change real fast, then the tube amp will be able to drive it pretty well. As long as the impedance, even if the impedance is low, even if it's 4 ohm, if you have 4 ohm transformer taps on your tube amp, it's going to be fine. It's actually more the phase than anything else. So when people say the speaker is highly reactive or it's a reactive load, they're really talking about capacitive and inductive effects that create a complex load. And you can see that in the impedance plot, because you see wide swings in the abrupt swings in the impedance. So first of all, our designs are open baffle. So it's a simpler, less reactive load to begin with. Our crossover designs are simple. The woofer designs on all of the models are second order on what's called a high pass. So what's filtering the bass out of the rest of the speaker is those in all of our models, there's only 2 components. So that's, and some of these designs are obviously can get crazy. They can have 50 parts in the crossover. So those generally have a more reactive, complex loads. Tubes are not going to be happy with that unless they've done what's called impedance compensation. And KEF does that, where they'll have a separate circuit that's called a Zobel circuit that will linearize that impedance curve, and that helps. But there's trade-offs with everything. But that's the number one thing, is the complexity thing. But even though, let's say the load's not reactive and the tube amp can drive it, it still has to be relatively efficient in order to drive it loud enough if the tube amp is small. So if you have an SET amp, and I think a lot of this stuff, you guys already know this stuff, but SET amps don't like reactive loads at all. They themselves have a high output impedance. So if their self-impedance is 2 ohms, then, well, a 4 ohm load's only double their own impedance, the output impedance. That's a problem. You're going to have poor bass control. So you need some distance between the amp's self-output impedance and the speaker's impedance in order to get good damping, which means bass control. And even then, if it's a 2 watt or 8 watt SCT, even if the speaker is optimized, is it efficient enough for that amplifier to drive it to the maximum sound pressure level that I use in my house? So in general, these smaller amps like a 300B, you need above 90 in order to, it might drive an 88 dB speaker, but probably not very loud without it starting to sound like it's coming apart, like the bass gets real flabby and all of that. Now, as I've mentioned on a lot of other video interviews, the number one thing in my mind, though, is how good the output transformers are of the amplifier. If it's a high quality amplifier, like a Manley or an Audion, or there's a bunch of them that have really good whammer dime. That's the whole shebang to me, as long as you're not trying to play it at ear bleeding levels. So quality tube amplifiers are where it's at, I think. Anyway, is that enough on that topic?
Yeah, I think so. I have a couple questions about placement and room size.
All open baffle speakers need to be about 3 feet away from the wall in order to generate the amount of bass that I have designed into it. In other words, for level matching across the rest of the spectrum. Because if you go closer to the wall, you're going to get more cancellation from the wall behind it. So in other words, that counter wave that's coming off the front wall comes back and it creates some cancellation, which means bass loss. So as you pull the open baffle speaker away further, you're going to get more bass. Okay, so 3 feet is where I have it designed to where at that point you're going to get the proper level across the spectrum. You can work around that quite a bit by, if you put a bass trap behind an open baffle speaker, you can put the speaker closer and still have the same amount of bass, but you will compromise the sense of depth perspective possibly. That's you know, the soundstage effect really is related to how far the speaker is out away from the wall, which gets back to what I always say is that 3 feet might sound like a lot, but what good box speaker doesn't have to be 3 feet away from the wall? If you want depth and soundstage, I think that's just, it doesn't really matter. It's just that an open baffle, it's a requirement. You don't have a choice. Whereas a box speaker, you can put it against the wall, but who wants to do that? It's not going to sound very good. A lot of box speakers sound a lot better 10 feet away from the wall. But yeah, so that's how that works. Now, as far as room size goes, it's really like any other speaker. What's one thing that's kind of cool though is, and I think Leslie might have, I think you even mentioned this one year. It was like you were walking around and you're like, these just sound good walking around the room. And
Yes.
You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
I spent a
lot of time in your room, Clayton. It was
Yeah.
it was always one of my favorites. So yes.
But I think that's a, yeah, I remember you saying that. And a lot of people at the shows don't get an opportunity to notice that because you walk in the room, you know, and you have to sit there in those chairs and the rooms are narrow and, you know, you don't get to really walk around. But this idea that you do other things besides sit in a sweet spot is really a great advantage with an open baffle speaker because you get that kind of, like when Magnapans are the same way, you know, you can get up and do stuff or have your work desk off at an angle somewhere and it sounds, it's not as good as being in the perfect stereo center, but it sounds good everywhere. So it's a much more friendly kind of product approach. And there's a lot less bass transmission through the walls and the floor, which we hardly ever talk about. But if you live in an apartment, condominium, or there's, you know, issues with family members in the next room over, open baffle almost completely solves this problem of bass energy transmission through the structure. It just goes on and on. I mean, there's just so many benefits that I just can't even imagine designing a box speaker anymore. I don't get it. But so as far as room size, it doesn't matter. If you put a, you know, like in Larry's room, tell me again what your, wasn't your room fairly small?
Yeah, it's only 11 wide by 12 deep.
Yeah, okay, so that's what I would call a bedroom sized room, where we get a lot of people saying that that's the only way they can create a dedicated room effect is when the kids grow up, move away, you know, they have an opportunity. It's like, here's a couple of rooms here that I can commandeer. So, but they're always like that. They're 10 by 13, pretty small. Open baffle works well because while it sounds better in a big open room where there's a lot of airspace, it doesn't sound boomy, even if the room is 8 by 8. It never, I don't know if there's a limit case on there, it never sounds boomy. Whereas box speakers, you better, in a room like your size, buy a stand mount mini monitor, because if you have a larger speaker, it's just going to sound muddy and boomy usually, even if it's a sealed box design. So there's no no limit on how small the room could be. And there's really not any limit on the upside either. We might say if the room was quite large, if it was 20 by 30 or something like that, we might say you need to get an X5 or an X3 because we want to, that speaker will project the energy across the room better because it has controlled directivity waveguides and that sort of thing. But it's so much easier to get good. Ron, if you guys have watched some of what Ron has been saying on the new record day videos, he noticed right away how you could just almost just put them in the room and not even pay any attention to the setup. They sound good. So they kind of automatically sound good. It's a matter of how good, much better than that can we get them with fine tuning, you know. And I usually provide support in that regard. Like when people buy it, I'm always happy to, you know, send me a picture of your room so we can talk about it. Let's say, okay, here's the amp you have, here's the placement you currently have, and you just like, you can do whatever you want, but I'll give you my 2 cents, and particularly if I think you really need room treatment or not. So I think since we don't have dealers really anymore, and we have live video capability or FaceTime at least, I think the manufacturers should be stepping up and helping customers with tuning of their systems to the degree they can, you know, remotely.
Very good. I have another question here about baffle design. Have you looked at curved or rounded baffles?
Well, sure. We have looked at that for over 30 years. I mean, that was one of the things in the there weren't many early textbooks. There was one from 1957 that's kind of the standard for basic information, and there's a lot of data in there about how the shape of the enclosure affects the response, and it's a lot of the results that they showed were not what they were counterintuitive. They're like, I wouldn't think that would be a problem, but it is. And so squares are bad, for example. One of the worst things you can do, probably the worst, is to take a round driver and put it on a round baffle. And you would think that that would make sense, that would be a good idea. That'll cause the largest amount of frequency response ripple of any shape that you can use. So, and a square is bad, but rectangles are actually very good, and all of our designs are rectangles, but it's not very cost effective for the most part to produce something that's highly optimized. Like, let's say, remember the teal, like most of the teal speakers had extremely large radiuses. A radius doesn't do any good unless it's really, really big. So these superficial radiuses that you see on speakers don't really do anything. So that's kind of a marketing thing. So, you know, how do you make a really big radius? You can do it with MDF. In fact, the backside actually of your speaker, Larry, the M series has a large radius, but in our traditional speakers that used horn-loaded tweeters and the new X series, the Lumina, all these other models, we found a long time ago that drivers that where the element is recessed and it's horn-loaded, that the boundary effects don't really amount to a whole lot. You can measure it a little bit, but it's not much of an effect at all. So a surface-mounted driver like a dome tweeter, that's much more affected by the edge diffraction and the shape of the speaker. But in our case, we're not using, this thing's not really a tweeter. So I need, at 600 Hertz, I need a big baffle because I have a big, 2-foot long wavelengths that we're trying to reproduce out of this driver. So a mini monitor kind of size would work, but it wouldn't work as well as this because I need this big supporting platform for these low frequencies coming out of that mid-treble unit. Yeah, did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Another one here, I was looking at the website and could not find a good collection of images of the different finishes you're using. Did I miss it?
I think they missed it. The website is still under construction, but for about the last 2 months or so, we've had, like what you guys just saw when we brought up the website a minute ago, that shows all the finishes except for red, that shows all of them. On the X series, when you click into the product description, there are wood samples, actual wood samples of the Ultra Lamb. So yeah, the website has all that.
Yeah. And one more from this email string. relates to R&D processes. How does the role of objective measurements versus subjective listening play during R&D phase for your speakers? Also, do you use any statistical techniques?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd say that we've been doing it so long is that we have what you could call a bag of tricks. In other words, we're not, when we come out with a new model, we're not starting from scratch and saying, oh, how are we going to design an open baffle, speaker? Or it's really a matter of continuing. What's really happening is that we already know how to do it, but we do R&D on new kinds of drivers and new types of circuits and things like that. And if we come up with a breakthrough or something that is a noticeable improvement, we'll kind of add that into the mix that we already have. So it's really a progression and an evolutionary approach. But no matter how much, we base everything on measurements, okay? And you get different designers, different audio guys will either say measurements are useless or that's all that matters or whatever, but most speaker designers don't say that. If they know how to design speakers, they've found most likely that it is an engineering adventure, so you have to use measurement and theory and simulation to whatever level makes sense in your particular approach. But after you've done that, you have to fine tune it by listening, as far as I can tell. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you an example of that is if you have this beautifully linear frequency response on the screen, well, if it was half a dB lower or half a dB higher, I probably wouldn't notice that on the screen. I couldn't make a decision. I couldn't really say it looks linear and it looks right. Yet I can walk over and put a 1 ohm resistor in series with the tweeter and drop it, half a dB, and clearly hear it. And what you're looking, so you have to do the fine tuning by ear if you want it to be really good. And when I say really good, what I'm looking for is to get not only the kind of balance where when I go to shows, a lot of box speakers to me sound thin in the lower mid-range, like male vocal particularly can sound kind of washed out and thin. Well, and then you measure the speaker and it's like, well, duh, in a actual room, like do an in-room measurement, you can see the dip right there at 200 hertz. It may not be in the anechoic measurement, but it's in the room measurement. Okay, so, but more than anything, I think it's in this treble range where you have to adjust it to where it sounds balanced, because the overall tonal balance from top to bottom from 100 hertz to 10K is the #1 most important thing to when somebody listens to a speaker and makes a judgment call. There's 100 other things that they're going to be looking for, but if the tonal balance tilt is wrong, it's too bright, it's too lean, you're going to notice that immediately and make a pretty high level judgment call on this way the speaker sounds, at least in that room setup. So I look for that. I've got to get the tonal balance right, but I'm looking ultimately for essentially the pitch accuracy. Does it sound like the instrument? This is where the piano thing comes into play again. If I can and the tweaks that you're making get smaller and smaller. You might start out with a rougher amount of change, and you progressively get closer to what you think sounds accurate. But then you continually go back and measure, though. You have to validate what you're doing, because sometimes I've gotten off track and thought I liked something, and then I measured it. Man, that's just not, it does sound better in this area, but it screwed up something at 300 hertz or whatever. So you have to be really careful. But over time, you can, over the course of weeks or months, you can get where you want across the whole spectrum. And sure enough, almost always that turns out it measures good. Speakers that measure bad, well, I'll say it the other way around. Speakers that sound good almost always measure good. There's some controversy about that. I've heard speakers that I thought sounded pretty good and they didn't measure well. But it's most of the time, measurements correlate pretty well if you're measuring the right thing and you have proper measurements set up, So.
All right, getting back to the chat questions. Any plans for a lower cost, say $2,000 speaker?
Yeah, there is a whole new platform technology that we have. Maybe I should go ahead and share that now. That's what I was talking about earlier. Yeah. Let's see if I can. Okay, can you see that?
Yep, yep.
Okay, so that obviously is a small speaker. This is an early stage. I mean, there's been a lot of engineering development, but we don't even have a name, you know, a series model or anything for it yet. But so that's why I don't want to get too public with this. But
What's the scale size?
it is 12 inches wide and 18 inches tall. So it's technically a bookshelf speaker. It's a 10-inch open baffle design. The chassis is a thick American Kaiser aluminum, just like Magico uses. The whole thing's solid aluminum, which is very, you know, really makes it sound super clean. And it's designed for, you know, high-end desktop type, you know, playback, studio monitors, home high-end audio on a desktop or bookshelf, that kind of thing. You just can't put it up flat against the wall is the only requirement, but it's extremely holographic. When you get in the near field of an open baffle speaker, it's crazy. It's a lot like headphones. So what we did here is we built a no compromise product where it has, you know, like WVT next gen connectors, like you'd see on our on all of our models, but that's the best terminal on the market. We use that. The M100 tweeter that is in the M series, that's one that we've talked about that goes such a wide frequency range. It's exactly the same driver, no compromises. It's a 10-inch paper cone eminence, specially designed bass driver, bass mid unit. And it has an isolated crossover. You can't really see it very well, but that black guy on the back it looks like a toroidal transformer, but it's the crossover network is mounted in there. So it's very simple. The idea behind it is that it's very fast to assemble so that we can produce as many as we want per day, because this thing is aiming to be priced at $9.95 a pair. So we're up against all this mass market Chinese slave labor stuff. And so it has to be, and so that's how we're doing is we can compete with China in that sense by taking essentially the labor component out of it. And the metal is all done by CNC with a water jet, and a CNC machine bends the aluminum and all that. So that's all automated. It can be done high volume, low cost, but it's a true audiophile speaker. It's not just a cheap speaker that looks nice. It's actually a real audiophile speaker. So then,
Clayton, would that work as a stand mount by any chance?
you can't, yeah, we haven't done a lot of work with that yet because it's not really aimed at that market for two reasons. One is this speaker, if you put it on a stand, it's no problem, but what you would want to do is put a solid front on the stand to create, just like Wilson did when the Watt first came out in 78 or whatever it was, 87. Before the Puppy came out, they just had this box that created a support area lip for it. And so that would work on an open stand. It would still sound probably fine, but it's going to sound lean. So I wouldn't recommend that. But the reason number two is that we're planning on making a companion model that's a floor standing model that has two of the 10-inch woofers in a speaker that is about 36 inches high, and trying to get that out at $14.95. You know, it'll really depend on how the costing comes in, because the metal is pretty expensive when it gets that big. But if done correctly and we're able to price it at those numbers, it should be pretty revolutionary, because everything on the market right now in that range is pretty much all the same thing. And I've found, I mean, a lot of audio guys, they have second and third systems. So this is our own customers, you know, will buy them as well, but it's really aimed at kind of this younger, there's quite a movement starting to take root now of a new hi-fi movement, but the price range is kind of like the 500 to 1500 range for speakers, and so that's the idea. Anyway, so get rid of that, stop sharing.
Very cool. Those look neat. Another one in the chat box. Do you have a preference between tube or solid state amplifiers?
I stay pretty neutral when I talk to customers, because you can get really great results either way. I kind of, like I said earlier, my main advice is don't buy a cheap tube amp. That seems to be the big problem. Good tube amps, I love them. As far as my own personal listening, I prefer tube amps. I have the linear tube audio amplifiers. I have all of their models, and that's the David Burning Zodal direct drive technology, where there's no output transformer. I like the way those sound, and they're not too super expensive. And the Don Sachs integrated, I have the world's first integrated amp he made. He just sent that to me. He bought our X5 model, and it was just, you know, was finishing up on this integrated. He tried it, said it sounds great. I'm going to send it to you, see what you think. I listened to it the last couple of days, and it's absolutely amazing. So of all the stuff that we have in our listening rooms, that would probably be, if I had one choice to make. You know, it's a specialized amplifier, obviously, and it's very limited in power. It's 22 watts, but it sounds incredible. So yeah, I'm more of a tube guy.
All right. Let's see. I logged in late. Do you use DSP to compensate for increased dipole cancellation? I think you answered that.
We no longer do. We used to.
How well would your speakers integrate with Magnapan surrounds or subwoofers?
Mm-hmm. With subwoofers, it's really more up to the subwoofer. The speaker, it's easy to integrate into an open baffle speaker, but subwoofers in general are not that easy to work with, partially because they're physically distanced away from the main speaker. And so your phase interaction problems, you're already off to a tough start right from the beginning. Plus, as far as I know, other than the Danny Ritchie GR Research Servo open baffle sub, there aren't any open baffle subs on the market. So box subs, the good ones, again, if you get a good one, like the Rail sounds pretty good, the JL Audio and the Rhythmic. And then if you use one of those and then make the crossover point quite low, like 40, to where you're not sort of ruining the open baffle bass sound, and keeping it low and focusing on creating a foundation to the sound, then I'm fine with that. If you do it well, if you do it right, get it integrated correctly. The surround thing that you mentioned with Maggie surrounds, that's a pretty cool idea. I've never thought of that, but it probably works quite well since it's open baffle, and it's Magnapans are usually pretty forgiving, you know, and have a similar kind of open presentation to our speakers, I would think it might be a pretty easy thing to do. So I think Larry got up and left for a minute. Let's see.
Clayton, when are you going to be selling the new speakers that you're talking about? Did I miss that?
When I'm done. You never know. You know, it's, I've worked in large companies, and so this small company thing's quite a bit different. There's more flexibility because you're not on really a schedule, but you're also going, like if I go to a metal company let's say that's going to make this chassis, well, you know, Zero Halliburton that makes those cool James Bond attaché cases, they're going to make that can that goes on the back for the crossover. So that's American made too. That's a really cool thing. But when you walk into a place like Zero, which is based here in Salt Lake, you know, we're not some big multinational company. So you don't tend to get the kind of response time and so forth that you would if you were a larger company. So it tends to drag out the development, or not the development cycle, but the time to market is dragged out somewhat. But I think Zero was very interested in helping us. So I think my goal is to get it, you know, in production and shipping by November. And if I can get it done sooner, great. But I think that's kind of the timeline, is November or December, something like that.
And you said that there's no dealers anymore. So how do you market your product these days? Other than SFAS webinars.
Right. Well, you know, the combination of things I've been doing are you know, just what everybody else is doing now that the dealer model's kind of dead, is Audio Circle, going to as many shows as you can, and spending the time with customers to explain what you're doing, and then showing them, you know, setting up demos. You know, a lot of times a guy, just like Mark White's a good example. Don Sachs went down and heard his system, I believe, or the other way around. But you know, it's like if a guy calls me and says, "I've heard all about these, where can I hear them?" You know, I'll try to hook them up with somebody that's in their area within driving distance. And that's the way it's been for years. This company never was sold through dealers, but now it's a lot easier because we don't even have to do anything. I mean, the orders just come in all the time. So there's a traction thing that we've achieved now to where, and we don't advertise. So the word gets around and we're busy. That's all I can say. But going forward, a better way to answer it is that this new speaker that we're talking about, this desktop speaker, it has the potential to revolutionize that part of the market. But the way we've traditionally sold isn't going to cut it, because millennials, for example, will not know about it if we don't get it out there. So the podcaster guys, that there's a whole slew of them that are in their 40s and 30s that are reviewing moderately priced audio, like Ron at New Record Day is an example, or Zero Fidelity, all these kind of Guttenberg, these guys. There's a lot of volume can come out of that, and a lot of awareness. And so that's one of the key things we're going to do for this new series, as well as general advertising. We are going to have to promote it and do some more sort of Amazon kind of like promotion to get awareness going. But that thing will, since it's different and new and amazing sounding, I think that thing will kind of go viral. So we'll see. I mean, I've never been in that price range before.
Okay, well, if you need some beta testers, we'd be willing to volunteer.
Well, you know, that's actually, I'm glad you said that, because there's a product that's small enough and low priced enough to where I can send a bunch of them out, whereas you can't really do that on these bigger models. So I could, you know, send a pair of you, see if you like them, and, you know, send them on to the next person.
Yeah, and we actually did that before. I think we did that with one of Merrill's amps once, and several products where basically you send it to one and then we send it to the next, and everybody gets to listen to it and they all share it. And these are small, so we could do something like that if people are interested.
Yeah, that's known as being on tour. You know, you put the product on tour, and this product's perfect for that. And and it's so good too, and it gives the people that are not familiar with this approach a feeling of what open baffle is like. So if they tried it, they might say that this is cool. I want a pair for my office, but I'm going to get a pair of M3s now that I've heard these things. And so it could lead to a migration effect as well.
Yep.
Clayton, excuse me, Clayton, I wanted to ask you about your tweeter on your unit, the one that Larry has there as an example. Have you tried at all moving it around as opposed to having it directly above the woofer to see what might sonically sound better, worse, or in between?
Yeah, we have done that. Anything off center, though, of course, means it's got to be a mirror imaged pair. And so it's not good from a manufacturing standpoint, which is why there's very few companies that have an off center tweeter, because if they're doing volume, it's kind of a pain in the butt. I think it's a little better off center, but what we found was if it's close to the top, like it is, like in our design where it's just a few inches from the top, that's the main thing, number one. Secondly is, again, it's covering a really wide spectrum. So it's actually better to be in the middle or close to the middle for that application too, to where it's doing a lot of heavy lifting, at 600 Hertz. But yeah, it is a little better off center, but it's not better enough for the impact that it has on manufacturing, in my view.
Thank you, sir.
Leslie, may I ask a question?
Sure.
Mark White here in excuse me, in Sacramento at about 110 degrees today. I've known Clayton for about 5 years, since I first got his Turbo S M4s. And after maybe 25 speakers over 45 years, I landed on Audio Nirvana, and subsequently sent them back for the upgrade to the Triode Masters. And I still am enthralled with them. Well, I'm verklempt, as they would say. My good friend and Clayton's friend, Don Sachs, who's Don Sachs amp and preamp I've had since its inception, recently got the X5s, and we visit all the time. And he published a review, or I think he sent a review to Clayton of the X5s, and Clayton published it on Audio Circle. And I would advise all of the folks that are listening here today to read that review on Audio Circle, which I think kind of circles back to what Clayton said. The speakers sound, and he's got a compromised room with lots of glass in it. Mm-hmm. It sounds like no speaker at all. And well, my next move is going to be to those speakers. As much as I love these speakers, they're clearly a step above what I've got now, which I absolutely love. I could live the rest of my old life with them, but it's clearly a quantum leap ahead for a lot of the reasons that Clayton has mentioned today. So a shout out, I guess, to Don Sachs, my old my tube guru, and Clayton's new speakers, to encourage you all to go to Clayton's Spatial Audio website on Audio Circle and read that review. It's revealing, it's accurate, it's lengthy, and incisive. So that's my shout out to my old friend Clayton, and I'll tell you, from my perspective, once you've heard spatial audio speakers, open baffle speakers with so little room interaction, and Clayton knows the problem I've got with my compromised room, it's no issue at all. It's no issue at all. So hopefully, you know, the 35 folks here will read Don Sachs' review of his new X5s, which are my next move. God bless you, Clayton.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, you know, I've met you. I've never met Don, right? But Don actually, in a lot of ways, represents the same kind of conundrum that everybody has now with where we don't have retailers, because he's heard all about the product, and I think did he hear your M4s, Mark, or did you just tell him that?
No, actually, Don heard them in Canada, where he lives, and then 5 years ago said to me, and I had Joseph Audio's speakers, the RM25XLs. He said, "Look, you're going to like these much better. You know, they'll be more room appropriate." And so I bought them, and then now 5 years later, Don bought them after a long wait for you know, this interesting upgrade that you did with the MyFlex capacitors, which I think is de rigueur for you know, for optimizing the performance of those speakers. So he got them, and again, everybody will see when they read, or will learn when they read that review. They were everything that he heard 5 years ago when he informed me that should be my next speaker purchase.
Yeah, well, you know, well, I won't get off into the weeds about the Audio Nirvana, because apparently that thing does sound good. But he bought the X5s without ever hearing them. So he was really, but I assured him, you know, if you don't like them, you can just return them. But that turns out to be the perfect speaker for him, because his room is there's like glass everywhere, you know, there's no room treatment. And so that control directivity thing basically saved him. And he mentions that in that review. He goes, I can move these things around and there's just no room interaction. Whereas before, he liked those Audio Nirvanas, but it was loaded in a box and he was having problems, you know, getting it to not sound boomy and all that stuff. And so, yeah, he's a big advocate now. And I think now fully understands that these 5 principles, if you use them all together, use all of them together, that you come up with something that's, you know, I'll let him say it, but it basically completely disappears. And that's the goal.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yep, yeah, yep. So yeah, hopefully everybody reads that review to learn more about somebody who's got a great ear, designs tube amplification, which I love. I'm a devotee. To hear what somebody that has them. So yeah.
Hey, Leslie, Don would be a good guy to have as a speaker, I would think, to come on.
Have we talked to him, guys? Larry?
I'm sorry?
I have not talked to him.
If we had talked to him about going on, yeah.
But we could reach out, yeah.
Yeah, he's a pretty interesting character and has a lot of experience. And he could probably, you know, and could talk to all day long about tube amp design and all that good stuff. But I see a chat question here. Did I miss a response or about the Sapphire coating? So it's not a coating. It's actually solid ceramic cap. This dome we're talking about on the M100. It's a single curved piece of synthetic sapphire. So it's not a substrate that's then like plastic or something that's then coated. So answer that question. I've seen the Lumina or dipole design or the other models. In the Lumina, which is about a $25,000 plus model, it has an active servo controlled twin 12-inch bass system built into it. That one, I think what I was talking about is that one and the X3 and X5, they have a cardioid open baffle open baffle treble system. AMT in the new ones and compression driver in the Lumina, but it's open on the back, but it's not horn loaded on the back, so it's not, I don't say it's really dipolar, it's basically a cardioid type of effect. And it's not done so much to have sound reflecting, but to take the cavity off the back of the driver. The driver just sounds better if you take the cavity off of it. So that's why we do that. Let's see. Larry, you want to hit me with another one?
I'll double check, but I think I've got most of them. Maybe somebody can.
Clayton, I have a philosophical question for you. So how do you think the industry is going to change post-COVID? Are you seeing people's habits changing? I mean, what I'm seeing is obviously people are spending more time at home, more time with their systems, getting into electronics more. I'm just curious to see if you think that there's going to be lasting changes.
I do, because I think that we're in for more of the same until we get a vaccine, is what it appears to. I'm no virologist, but it looks like this thing's pretty nasty, and we're going to have limitations on what we're going to want to do and until a vaccine is out. But I think in some ways our behavior may be somewhat permanently changed. I think we're going through behavioral modification in a lot of ways right now, in the way we just interact with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I see we could be doing these Zoom meetings forever, right? I mean, they're very effective. And I mean, have you seen that your demand has increased because people really are needing home entertainment?
Absolutely. May was the largest month in our 10-year history. And we weren't expecting that. When COVID, the day, whatever it was early March, the day that the stock market crashed and went to 20,000, it was just crickets, which is what you'd expect. And for about a month, not much happened. So we just figured that's kind of going to be the norm. We didn't know any different. But yeah, slowly we started receiving orders, and the guys on the phone were saying that. They were saying, I've never had so much fun with hi-fi before, because now I can actually spend some time and it's fun and I'm getting back into it. And secondly, a lot of us are older and they're feeling like, the risk is such that I'm just better off staying at home. And thirdly, if you watch the news for very long, you're sick of it within a short period. That after you learn what's going on with COVID, it's just too depressing to watch the news. And so it's like a safe haven, to get back into music. So we've had an overwhelming number of people say something like that, and it has translated into very high sales. And I expect that to continue, and I expect that across the board. Once this new little speaker comes out, for example, I think young people are no different. They're home. If anything, they're the ones that are really, the knowledge workers that are working from home on workstations. And that's partly why we're coming out with that little speaker.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a great idea. That's absolutely what you should be doing.
I think one of the things that's happening is that when you can't go on vacation and you can't leave your house,
mm-hmm.
the money that you would otherwise spend on a vacation, people are spending in other ways.
Yep.
And hi-fi is one of those ways.
Yeah.
Well, so just to add to what Clayton was saying, I know a couple of folks in the industry, and their experiences are exactly concordant with Clayton's, which is folks are home. Many of the audiophiles have discretionary income, and they're spending it on gear. And sales are for high-end audio are actually quite good, in this situation. So.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of something we ask all of our speakers, is there an SFAS discount? Clayton?
A what?
Is there an SFAS, Audiophile Society discount that you offer?
Oh, I thought you were talking. No, maybe I should look into that though. But let me just tell you a little bit quickly about our pricing, because traditionally, it's very common, particularly, after you've been most people that are into hi-fi have been into hi-fi a long time, so we kind of know what the game is. And what I've decided to do is a little awkward sometimes, and that is that the price is the price. And some people just can't stand that. It's like, and I understand that. It's like, well, at least just give me something, 5%, 2%, just give me some kind of discount so I feel like I, made a good deal. But I'm doing it the way I want to do it as a consumer, meaning that, in other words, if you could give me 5%, then why aren't you selling it 5% less? I mean, do I have to bug you about giving me a discount? I mean, that whole thing, I'm not a big fan of that. And so it comes off, some people are kind of like, well, you're just not letting me in on the good deal or something, and don't like that. But we've done it long enough where I think most people understand that my theory is, if the product is simple and to build, and you can streamline the production system, and you can sell a lot of them, and you don't have the dealer markup, then if you just price it based on what it's costing you and what you need to make to run the company, then that's the honest price. And anything different, if it's lower than that, you're an idiot. If it's higher than that, I just don't want to be doing that. So, and Don Sachs mentioned in his thing, he goes, I got kind of a little industry discount from Clayton. That's pretty, and no consumers get that. In other words, I don't even do that with manufacturers normally. It just sells at the price. That's the price. The X5s are $69.50 a pair. That's the price, And over the long haul, I've really enjoyed that, because that's not another dimension that I have to deal with, kind of like dealing. I don't want to be dealing. It's like the product is worth a lot more than what we're pricing it at. And it's way underpriced, but it's priced high enough where we can operate the company, and be sustainable, and not, but not least, it's not only sustainable, but it's sustainable with highly paid workers. The lowest paid guy in the company is $25 an hour. So I'm trying to run the company the way I would, want anybody else to do it. It's a family business. There's no shenanigans. A number of family members work there. Everybody gets paid a lot. Everybody does great work. That's the kind of business I want to have. I want to keep it simple. And if you start getting into discounting and playing pricing games, then that's an added dimension I don't want to mess with and don't like.
Okay. Have you had a hard time keeping employees because of COVID? Has that impacted your ability to build things?
No, but we didn't have to. In Utah, we didn't have to do any forced closure, so we didn't. We weren't really affected by it. Plus, we have a pretty big building. Like if we were building electronics, we were all jammed in together, like linear tube audio, where there's all these people all, that might be a problem. But our building's big enough, and we don't, to where when you're in speaker manufacturing, it's a lot of open area. So we are really already socially distanced anyway. So we're not even wearing masks, and we haven't had any problems. And we haven't had to lay people off. And like I said, once the orders kicked back up, we've been busier than we've ever been. So we can't lay anybody off anyway.
Hi, Clayton.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in your speaker, and I was just one quick question. You're in Utah, and I'm out here in California. And I know speakers really generally in line are very reliable, but what happens if I have an issue, crossover, driver, or just something, how is that handled, from such distances?
Yeah. Well, the first part of the answer is when I introduced that first speaker, the Emerald Physics CS2 in 2008 or 2007, the theory was, hey, we're using pro audio, sound reinforcement parts. You can't blow them up. What's going to possibly happen to this thing? And I think there were several thousand pairs of those that sold, and there was a guy one time that's called up and said the woofer was rubbing, the voice coil was rubbing on one, and it wasn't field repairable because of this theory of you can't blow them up anyway, why worry kind of thing. This guy somehow got the woofer to, to scrape. So I had no choice. I paid to have it shipped back and covered it under warranty, even though it was probably abuse of some type. So yeah, the customer is number one. We do whatever we have to do. I had a guy that had a driver problem on a Lumina which is a real high-tech, expensive driver, this coaxial pro driver in Houston. And I could have just sent them drivers and said, just take them out and replace them yourself. But on a product like that, I just flew down there. I shipped the drivers to him, and then I followed it up with flying down, installed them myself. It turned out to be great. He's a great guy. We hung out, very interesting guy. So you do whatever you have to do. But for the most part, we don't have field problems because we're using high power drivers. And crossovers, if you do it right, you shouldn't really be having problems. Like none of our crossovers have resistors in them. So, sometimes you'll see resistors overheat or so. We don't have any. So there really isn't anything to fix. It's more like if you had a big DC offset from your tube amp or something that, you had DC go into the speaker and lock the woofer up. That could happen to any kind of woofer, but we've never had that happen, where the woofer would seize. So we just don't have any customer service problems to speak of. But if anything does come up, we're all over it immediately, because without you guys, we don't have a company. That's who we are, is you guys,
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're about over our time. So if anybody has any last questions, if not, I think we can wrap it up.
There was somebody who posted a question twice about what music do you use when you're evaluating your speakers? Maybe piano? But
piano, yeah. Piano, and I have some, I've got a lot of recordings, but maybe it's laziness, but I think it's actually a good idea, though, in a sense, to where you play a lot of different things. What you want to do is have 20 or 30 kind of reference recordings, but then there's only 3 or 4 that I always play over and over and over again because I know them so well and they're so useful. And I even hate that. It's embarrassing to tell you what some of them are, like the Love Scenes album from Diana Krall, okay? I know everybody likes to make fun of her. I like her, and I've seen her in Park City live outdoors. She's great. She has a great band. She's, and her albums are recorded in such a way where they're the band and the piano she's playing, and her vocal information, I know what it sounds like. So I use that a lot. There's a track called Calypso Minor from a guy that's, I think it's a European artist. It's a really hard to pronounce name. I can post it sometime, but that's a very dynamic thing that has a lot of percussion instruments in it, and piano and saxophone. I use that every time. And what you want is kind of obvious, is that you can find the right recordings in the right methodology to where you're getting good correlation with what your customers hear. Meaning that if I go to the show and I say, here it is, it's done, the new M3, I love it. And everybody goes, oh, I don't like it. What you want, we haven't had that problem. So I think I've, through a lot of work and maybe a little bit of luck, have created a methodology to voice speakers to where most people agree. Most people go, yeah, that sounds like you told me it was going to sound, because 90-something% of the customers are buying these speakers without hearing them first. So I better be pretty accurate in what I'm describing, otherwise that's not going to work, right? So I think, I listen to a lot of Prokofiev and Mahler, stuff like that, Beethoven. I'm not actually a huge classical guy, but I use it for development purposes. I listen to a lot of jazz. I mean, you can take an album like Ray Brown's Solar Energy is the name of the album. Holy crap. I mean, that's like about the only album you need. You can play that, and that one right there, and if you want to hear the difference between box and open baffle bass, stand-up string bass, just play that album. And it's not an audiophile recording. So, that kind of stuff. So it's across the board. I don't necessarily have to love it. I have to be able to tolerate it, because I may have to listen to it several hundred times. But after a while, you're past the obnoxious point. You don't even notice it anymore. But yeah.
Okay. And any others? I think let's see if we missed any.
I have one comment. I have not spent 2 more wonderful hours in my life that I can ever remember than listening to the design philosophy and which results in Clayton's wonderful speakers. I am just delighted that Leslie, the Audio Society put this together. Clayton spent a couple of hours. I'm verklempt. Had a great time today. Thanks for hosting this. And Clayton, thank you for spending the time, which maybe, I'm guessing, maybe the most detailed, intimate discussion about your design philosophy that's ever been done before. And I followed them all. So I hope you can post this somewhere online for folks that were not able to hear it. So
yeah, we do. Yeah, we do post it online, but thank you very much too. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks, Clayton. This is really great.
Thank
you. We look forward to seeing your new speakers out here. We all want to hear them. And I'm going to go over to Larry's house and listen to his.
What I was thinking, it's not, we can't do this yet, but what I was thinking, in fact, Leslie suggested this years ago, is to, when things kind of ease up and we can travel, is me come out and bring a couple different models, like an M3 or X3, and set it up at somebody's house, like Leslie's or whoever, and everybody just show up for a meeting. That way, it's, you know, we can talk all day, and I barely even scratched the surface of the design philosophy part of it. But what, you know, at the end of the day, if I could just play one song, you'd understand what I was talking about. So we ought to do that.
Yep. Yeah. And I actually have an outdoor space. So if people are comfortable going out, we could think about doing something later in the year. We'll see. But it would really be, it would be great to be able to kind of physically get together again and to have you come out with that.
So Clayton, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I recently, the last few months, fell in love with some open baffle speakers. I bought some replacement speakers as my enclosure speakers are being upgraded. I got some Carver Amazing Loudspeaker Platinum 4s. And the realism, as you talk about playing piano and cello and the ambience in the room is what I love so much. But they are 25-year-old design and technology. So now, after listening to your talk, I'd love to be able to hear what new technology, a tweeter that can go to 600 hertz is awesome, and see what that is like. So you've sparked our interest, I think, and we would love to be able to hear it.
Yeah, great. I'd love for all you guys to hear it. It's a lot of fun, and it's something new. I mean, when you think about all the things that we're all into, you know, how often does something actually new come along that's different enough and better enough to where, you know, it's fun. It just opens up a lot of excitement that I don't think we've had in quite a while.
What characteristical differences might you say there would be between an M3 and an old Carver Amazing Loudspeaker?
I have heard that speaker, so you know, I can't remember everything, but the idea there that he had, and this is from him, and he's correct, is that he was able to get good bass out of the drivers by undersizing the motor assembly on it. That's why the magnet's a teeny tiny little magnet. And that gives you a real high, what's called QTS, so it's underdamped. So to offset the dipole roll-off effect from cancellation, this woofer, it goes up, it's louder as it goes down in frequency, which offsets this loss effect. But you can take that too far, you know, because the trade-off in a situation like that is just bass control. You just literally don't have what's called a BL factor. It's real low. You don't have the force on the magnetic force in the voice coil to give you the kind of bass control and tautness that would be optimal. Okay, but you're hearing though the natural advantages, meaning that even though it's an underdamped design, you're seeing what's happening, like eliminating room interaction and having that kind of big open organic feel. You know what I mean? So plus that's a ribbon speaker or a planar magnetics design, which has a lot of good properties, but it has trade-offs too. So that, because of how different it is from my design, mine would sound completely different is the answer. Plus that's a low efficiency design. So the modern designs are much more dynamic. The bass is a lot tighter, much better imaging specific. I can't say that word, but how specific the localizing of the instruments are in the field, and all of that are much better. So ours will sound more like a mini monitor in terms of like imaging and sound staging, but it has a lot more powerful and faster, more visceral bass than that design, because ours is not nearly as underdamped as that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Hey, I just want to add a comment before everybody breaks. I first heard about Clayton's work with this new design on a really good YouTube channel called New Record Day, which Clayton has cited a couple of times today. And I posted a really informative link in the show notes that an interview Clayton did about 3 months ago with Ron Burnett of New Record Day in there. And I encourage everyone that's interested to go watch that, because it's very, very well done. It's very informative, and Clayton goes into doing some drawings and showing why open baffle designs are better than the challenges imposed by box speaker designs. So if you guys are interested, I really recommend you check that out. It was really excellent.
Yeah, thanks.
Clayton, I just want to thank you for coming on, and I'm very interested in hearing your speakers. I become very interested in the 300B amplifier, which I'm looking at possibly getting sometime next year, and so we need something to match that, and it seems to be a pretty good match overall. And so I just can't wait for this COVID thing to end so I can go over and hear Larry's speakers.
Does Larry have do you have a tube amp? Larry, do you have a?
No, I have the Pass Labs XA 30.8. So it's a Class A 30 watt per channel, and it's plenty with my little room and these efficient speakers. It's more than enough power.
That's great.
I can bring a tube amp.
There you go. Yeah, XA 30.8 is an amp that we've owned in the past, and it's a fantastic amplifier. We did a lot of the development. Like Mark White's speaker was developed on that amplifier.
Clayton, would a diffuser behind the speaker be detrimental or good for that?
A what?
A diffuser panel.
A diffuser
behind
is.
the speaker?
Yeah, that won't affect bass. It'll generally affect the treble. So it's fine. It's better than a blank wall. But I think what's even better is to put low frequency absorption 4-inch thick panel absorbers right behind it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, Clayton, this was fantastic. We really appreciate your coming on, and we give you a big hand of applause, everybody.
Thanks, Clayton.
Thank you guys. I
Clayton.
really enjoyed that, and I appreciate your attention.
Clayton,
Okay.
what was the name of the album that you said you really liked? Ray Brown what?
Solar Energy.
Solar Energy. Thank you, sir.
And
Spelled
just so you know,
S-O-U.
solar is SOULAR.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like soul, exactly.
Yeah, it's an incredible album.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Everyone.
Bye,
Okay.
guys. See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks to everyone.